Okay, so let's read off the rest of this story on why climate doomerism is not good and why we need optimism but without complacency. So now we turn to the optimists. The unchangeable optimists, those in the upper right hand corner of our chart, are a dangerous groups. Let's go all the way back. So here we are, optimistic but not changeable. So the future will be better. It'll all work out fine. Basically, they are saying nothing to worry about, which is obviously not very smart. So they look at historical progress and believe it'll just continue, that climate change is not going to do anything. So they assume the world will continue to get better regardless of how hard we work to change it. So even if you want to stop using fossil fuels, they say no, no, it's fine, we should use it and keep developing, whatever. Complacency can get us into trouble though. We should never think that our rapid progress in healthcare, energy, technology and education for the past 2 centuries was natural or preordained. It has been an unprecedented boom and it's required deliberate action. It has required deliberate action from people who were not happy with the status quo. So change was sought and achieved. And today, of course, with unintended consequences. And today we need to adapt and push in different directions than we have in the past. Yes, we have made amazing strides in human well-being, but we now have very large, very novel problems to tackle, environmental ones. Of course, there is also the social media and the fake news, false informations, deep AI, and so on. Sticking it with what got us here won't solve the problem. Alex Epstein, the author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels and Fossil Future, Why Global Human Flourishing Requires More Oil, Coal and Natural Gas, Not Less, is a classic unchangeable optimist. He rightly argues that fossil fuels have transformed the lives of billions and says we should, for now, continue to exploit them to improve more lives, but this fails to acknowledge the problems with the fossil fuels, not only for the climate but for the millions of people who die from air pollution linked to fossil fuels every year. Epstein's argument may have may have made sense in the past when we did not have affordable, scalable alternative energy sources, but not now. Now we can keep building more renewables and not get stuck in this idea of the moral case for fossil fuels. Fossil fuel boosters demonstrate perfectly why unchangeable optimists are so wrong-headed. They want to maintain a status quo that doesn't serve us anymore. Their complacency only serves to slow the accelerated action needed to change our trajectory. As a self-identified optimist, I am always in danger of being boxed into this category. I fight hard to stop the label from sticking. I believe that if the arc of history bends towards justice, it's because we have made a concerted effort to change its trajectory. The path we are heading on is not okay, we need to redirect it. This is Hannah Ritchie talking, of course. This brings me to the changeable optimists. This is the group that thinks the future can be better but knows that a better future won't happen on its own. The world has lost lots of optimist change makers, even if they don't identify as such. People engineering new solar panels, batteries, and electric cars are changeable optimists. So are scientists at organizations like the Good Food Institute experimenting with ways to make plant-based and cellular meats, entrepreneurs like Boyan Slat, whose organization The Ocean Cleanup is trying to pull plastic waste out of the ocean, and policymakers pushing for sustainable policies. These people might not always put high odds on a better future. They may in fact think there is only a slim chance of success, but the act of trying creates possibilities that no one knew about before, which build a concrete case for optimism. Several years ago, for example, most wouldn't have predicted that renewable energy prices would drop so quickly and dramatically. Still a long way to go, but obviously a case for optimism. Changeable optimists don't shy away from criticism of the status quo. In fact, they're often its fiercest critics. People often mistake pessimism for critical thought and optimism for Pollyannaism. Pollyanna is this super optimistic, unrealistically optimistic person. In reality, progress is built by those who can look critically at a suite of solutions, discard the bad ones, and you don't want to discard the best ones, discard the bad ones, and find and sharpen the gems that remain. Pessimists use criticism as a wall, while optimists use it as a guiding door to walk through and make the future better. That's my comment. How we can become more optimistic. Sorry about that. Pessimism is hard to overcome precisely because it's often served humans well. History rewarded those who could detect threats early and fixate on them, but while pessimism might be good for survival, and survival was virtually all humanity had on its mind for most of its history except the last, let's say, 200 years, it's not good for the flourishing we could achieve in the future. At its best, pessimism helps us stay where we are. It doesn't give us the agency and determination to build something better for ourselves and especially for posterity. The world would be a much better place if we had more optimistic change makers, but there are key habits of the mind I have found that can engender precisely the brand of optimism we need. So you need social change. Most importantly, optimists take a long-term view of human progress. Many people forget how bad the human past was. Until last century, poverty was the default. Half of children died before puberty. Healthcare and education were non-existent for virtually everyone. Even with respect to the environmental health, our pre-industrial history was not as rosy as one might assume. The air our ancestors breathed was polluted from burning wood and charcoal. Indoor pollution was a killer as well. Evidence of damaged lung tissue has been found in Egyptian mummies and in the remains of 400,000-year-old hunter-gatherers. So pollution is now high, but it's not new. The only reason our aggregate planetary impact was low is that high child mortality kept the human population small. We hunted many of the largest mammals into extinction. I think that the world today is dismal. To think that the world today is dismal is to ignore the misery of our past. The idea that hunter-gatherers lived in harmony with nature, with clean air and clean water is just misplaced in reality. Even if you accept that we have made enormous progress from the past, you might look at the scale of the threats we face in the future and lose hope that progress will continue. But in thinking about today's challenges, it's crucial to look at change over time, not just snapshots in time. During any transition, changes can look small at first. It's the pace of change that's important. Renewable energy right now makes up just 29% of the global electricity production, but this is changing quickly. The International Energy Agency projects that almost all of the growth in electricity use in the next few years will come from renewables. Electric vehicles made up just under 10% of new car sales globally in 2021, but in 2020 it was just 4%, and the year before that it was 2.5%. It won't be long until EVs dominate the car market, and hopefully they will be charged with renewable energies, clean energies as well. Focusing on change over time doesn't make us optimistic by default. The early days of COVID-19 are a case in point. Many people underestimated the scale of the pandemic because they were looking at snapshots of reported cases and deaths. In early 2020, these were tiny. What they should have been focusing on was the rate at which these numbers were climbing, which told a much more worrying story. Looking at change over time doesn't always paint a rosy picture, but it does help us see the world more clearly and understand what future we might be heading toward. And in most respects, seeing the world more clearly means seeing it more positively. Similarly, we need to look at the complete picture, not isolated individual metrics, to understand complex problems. It's a systems approach. Global carbon emissions are still rising, which is bad, of course, but many of the underlying factors that determine the emissions, like growth of low carbon energy and emissions of wealthy countries, are changing quickly. There are details, but let's take it. We need to look at the inputs into the system, not just the output. We'll soon reach a tipping point when these inputs cause emissions to peak and decline, according to the IEA. That's the optimism I also want to hold on to. Finally, we should probably stop constantly reading the news. I used to read the news obsessively, thinking this was how to be knowledgeable about the world. FOMO, fear of missing out, makes us be always looking at social media and news. Every day I was hit with stories about the latest hurricane, flood, drought and wildfire. The problem is that I didn't actually know whether the impacts of these events were increasing or decreasing. I thought more people were dying from disasters than ever, but only because I mistook an increase in reporting and my own interest for an increase in the actual numbers. When I looked at the long-term statistics, I realized my perception was upside down. The news isn't a reliable barometer for the overall state of the world. I found that pessimists look at the news while optimists look at the data. Well, that's what we need to do. We must avoid complacent optimism, though. I often worry that people confuse changeable optimism with its counterproductive, unchangeable counterpart that's just as ineffective as pessimism. To avoid falling into the complacency trap, we need to hold on to an edge of dissatisfaction. It's not frustration or anxiety, it's dissatisfaction. It's not cynicism, it's skepticism to do more. Yes, many trends have been moving in the right direction, but we shouldn't pretend that this was the best we could do. As my colleague Max Roser has put it, the world is awful, the world is much better. The world can be much better. All three statements are true. We can acknowledge the progress that we have made, but remain dissatisfied that we haven't made more. We have reduced global child mortality to below 4%, but 5 million children under age 5 still die every year, most of them from preventable conditions like malaria, measles and diarrheal diseases. Early warnings are now possible to save many of these children. We can learn from this long-term decline in childhood mortality to understand what does and doesn't work. But then we need to turn those lessons into actions in places where child mortality remains high, which won't happen on its own. It needs active agency. We also need to be honest about the areas where things haven't been going well. Human progress has come at the cost of the environment and the lives of tens of billions of non-human animals that we slaughter for food, but that may have been a price worth paying in the past, but we shouldn't anymore and don't have to accept it anymore. Technological progress can build sustainability that works for people, the planet and the species we share this planet with. This is a totally different trajectory from the past and a track that complacent, unchangeable optimism won't get us on. Optimistic but dissatisfied is the broad road to progress. Let's make sure this coalition is as large and diverse as possible. So Hannah Ritchie is the deputy editor and lead researcher at Our World in Data and a researcher at the University of Oxford. You know, we don't have to agree with everything she is saying, but the main message is robust, needed, and really urgent. Changeable optimism. We need to change things, but we don't need to be pessimistic and anxious. We need to act and keep on acting to make things better, not just for us, but for the environment and for all the species. Okay, let's leave this here, and if there is a new topic that kind of is adding value to this, I'll add it, but right now I think I'll go and do a podcast on end of the world education, which is another favorite topic of mine. How do you bring changeable optimism? Is there education for the end of the world that we can provide to make kids be more optimistic and changeable? and be, dreaming about going to Mars, Moon, out of the solar system, building rockets, and not worrying to death about the planet coming to an end. Okay? See you.